Jake had 1 hour before they moved him to solitary confinement. 1 hour to get the evidence he had gathered to someone who could use it. 1 hour to expose the truth about what was really happening at Crex 9 Maximum Security Detention Facility. The problem was that Administrator Vex Prime controlled all communications in and out of the prison. He could block any message Jake tried to send and trace it back to whoever helped him. But Jake had spent weeks learning how the prison's systems worked, and he had found something Vex Prime did not know about. Hidden in the maintenance areas was an old emergency communication array that connected directly to Galactic Fleet Command. It was supposed to be used only if the prison was under attack, but Jake had discovered it during one of his repair jobs. More importantly, he had figured out how to access it without triggering the security protocols. The guards were busy preparing for Jake's transfer, so the corridors were mostly empty. Kex Nor was working alone in the main workshop when Jake slipped inside through the maintenance entrance. "You should not be here," Kex Nor said when he saw Jake. "Vex Prime has ordered all staff to stay away from you." "I need your help one last time," Jake replied. "I know who has been sabotaging the prison systems. I know why so many prisoners have been dying, but I need to get that information to the right people." Kex Nor's skin turned pale blue with fear. "If Vex Prime finds out I helped you, he will have me executed. If we do nothing more, people will die," Jake said quietly. "Including you and me and everyone else who knows too much." The four-armed alien looked around the workshop nervously, then made a decision that would change everything. "What do you need me to do?" Jake explained his plan while Kex Nor gathered the tools they would need. It was dangerous and complicated, but it was their only chance. If they could transmit the evidence to Galactic Fleet Command before Vex Prime stopped them, then outside authorities would have to investigate. They worked together to access the emergency communication array through a hidden panel in the workshop floor. Jake connected his data storage device while Kex Nor kept watch at the door. The transmission would take several minutes to complete, and they had to hope no one noticed the unusual activity. "Messages uploading," Jake whispered as data flowed through the communication link. 60% complete. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and both of them froze. But the footsteps passed by without stopping. The transmission continued flowing toward its destination, light years away. 80%, Jake reported. "Almost there." The workshop door burst open, and Lieutenant Crix Vo rushed inside. For a moment, Jake thought they had been caught, but then he saw the expression on the young guard's face. It was not anger or fear. It was determination. "Vex Prime knows what you are doing," Crix Vo said breathlessly. "He is coming here with a full security team. You have maybe 2 minutes. Why are you warning us?" Kex Nor asked. "Because Jake is right," Crix Vo replied. "This place is killing people, and we have been helping it happen. That has to stop." The transmission reached 95% completion just as more footsteps appeared in the corridor. These were heavier and more organized, guards in full combat gear moving with military precision. "Upload complete," Jake announced as he disconnected his device. "The evidence is on its way to Fleet Command." Vex Prime appeared in the doorway, surrounded by armed guards. His black eyes glowed with rage when he saw what they had done. "You have made a very serious mistake, Prisoner 4471. All of you have." "The fool. Only mistake was letting you run this place like a death camp," Jake replied as he stood up slowly. "But that ends now." The administrator raised a weapon that looked like it could punch holes through starship hulls. "No one will ever see your evidence, and no one will ever find your bodies." That was when Captain Zethka stepped into the workshop behind Vex Prime. The big guard captain was holding his own weapon, and it was pointed at the administrator's back. "I think you should put that down," Zethka said in his gravelly voice. "And step away from my people." Vex Prime spun around in surprise. "Captain, what is the meaning of this? I am a high administrator. You cannot threaten me." "You are a murderer," Zethka replied calmly. "And I am placing you under arrest for crimes against the Galactic Penal Code." What happened next moved very quickly. More guards appeared in the corridor, but they were following Zethka's orders instead of Vex Prime's. The corrupt administrator was surrounded and disarmed before he could react. His security team laid down their weapons when they realized they were outnumbered. "How did you know?" Vex Prime demanded as restraints were placed on his wrists. "Because we have been watching you," Zethka answered. "And because Jake Morrison taught us that following orders is not the same thing as doing what is right." 2 days later, a fleet of Galactic Authority ships arrived at Crex 9. Investigators swarmed through every level of the prison documenting evidence and interviewing witnesses. The corruption they found went far beyond what anyone had imagined. Jake was released from his cell and brought to a clean room with real windows and comfortable chairs. A human woman in an official uniform sat across from him with a data tablet and recording device. "My name is Colonel Patricia Stone," she said with a slight smile. "I am here on behalf of the Galactic Justice Ministry. We have reviewed your case and the evidence you provided. All charges against you are being dropped immediately." Jake felt relief wash over him, but he was not ready to celebrate yet. "What about the other prisoners? What about the guards who helped me? Captain Zethka and Lieutenant Crix Vo are being commended for their actions," Colonel Stone replied. "The other prisoners are being reviewed case by case. Many of them will be transferred to proper rehabilitation facilities." She paused and looked at her notes. "We would like to offer you a position with the ministry. Your insights into prison reform could help us prevent situations like this from happening again." Jake thought about the offer for a long moment. He could go home to Earth and try to forget everything that had happened here. Or he could stay and help make sure places like Crex 9 never existed again. "I would like to talk to Captain Zethka and the others first," Jake said finally. "This should be their decision too." 3 hours later, Jake found himself in the prison conference room with Captain Zethka, Lieutenant Crix Vo, Kex Nor, and even Lin Shaw, who had been released from her cell. They sat around a table as equals for the first time since they had met. "The ministry wants us to help design new rehabilitation programs," Jake explained, "to train guards and administrators throughout the galaxy, to make sure prisons become places where people can change their lives instead of just waiting to die. It will not be easy," Zethka said thoughtfully. "There are many people who believe punishment is more important than justice. But it is possible," Crix Vo added. "We proved that here. We showed that guards and prisoners can work together instead of against each other." Lin Shaw spoke up in her musical voice. "On my world, we have a saying. The river that flows together reaches the ocean faster than the streams that fight each other." Jake looked around the table at these people who had become his friends. They came from different worlds and different species, but they shared something important now. They had chosen cooperation over conflict. They had chosen hope over despair. "So we do this together," Jake said. "All of us." One by one, they nodded, their agreement. It would be hard work changing a system that had existed for centuries. There would be setbacks and failures and people who opposed them every step of the way. but they had already proven that change was possible. 6 months later, the first reformed prison opened in the Centauri system. Guards and prisoners worked together on construction projects and educational programs. Violent incidents dropped by 90% and recidivism rates fell to record lows. Other facilities began requesting consultations from the team that had transformed Crex 9. Jake stood in the observation deck of the new facility, watching humans and aliens work side by side in the workshops below. Through the large windows, he could see ships coming and going from the nearby space station. Some carried prisoners beginning their rehabilitation. Others carried former inmates returning to their home worlds as free citizens. Captain Zeth Ka joined him at the window. The big Vorthak scars had faded somewhat, and he looked younger somehow. "Do you ever regret staying?" he asked. "You could have gone home to your green world." Jake thought about Earth with its blue skies and familiar gravity. He missed it sometimes, but this work felt more important than anything he had done before. "This is home now," Jake replied. "These people are family," Zeth Ka nodded slowly. "The human who was dropped into our worst jail and made friends with the guards. That will be your legacy." "No," Jake said with a smile. "My legacy will be the thousands of people who get a second chance because we proved that change is possible." In the workshop below, Lieutenant Crix Vo was teaching a group of former prisoners how to repair environmental systems. Lin Shaw was leading a discussion group about conflict resolution. Kex Nor was training new maintenance staff from a dozen different species. They had built something here that had never existed before, a place where justice meant rehabilitation instead of revenge, where strength meant helping others instead of dominating them, where hope could grow even in the darkest corners of the galaxy. Administrator Vex Prime arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning when the artificial sun was just beginning to light up the prison corridors. Jake was in the workshop helping Kex Nor repair a water recycling unit when the alarm started wailing. But these were different alarms. These meant important visitors and emergency inspections. Jake looked up from his work to see guards running through the corridors in formation. Their movements were sharper than usual, and their weapons were held ready. Even Captain Zeth Ka looked nervous as he rushed past the workshop windows. "Who is Vex Prime?" Jake asked Kex Nor. The four-armed maintenance worker's skin turned a paler shade of blue. High Administrator from the Galactic Prison Authority. He comes to make sure prisons follow regulations. But Jake could tell there was more to it than that. The way Kex Nor's hands shook when he said the name. The way other workers suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else. This was not just about regulations. Through the security monitors, Jake watched a sleek black ship dock with the prison station. The figure that emerged was tall and thin with gray skin and eyes like black holes. Vex Prime wore expensive robes that seemed to absorb light, and his movements were smooth like oil on water. "All non-essential personnel report to quarters immediately," came the announcement over the prison speakers. "Administrator Vex Prime will conduct a full facility inspection." Jake started to leave the workshop, but Kex Nor grabbed his arm with two of his hands. "Be careful, human. Vex Prime does not like things that disrupt the normal order, and you have been disrupting many things." The warning came too late. As Jake walked back toward his cell block, he found Vex Prime waiting for him in the corridor. The administrator was studying a data tablet, and his black eyes never blinked as he looked Jake up and down. "Prisoner 4471, Vex Prime said in a voice like ice cracking. "The famous human terrorist. I have been reading your file with great interest." "I am not a terrorist," Jake replied calmly. "I was framed." Vex Prime smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Of course you were. They all say that, but your case is particularly interesting. A Deathworld human who has somehow gained the trust of guards and prisoners alike, who has been allowed unusual freedoms, who has been interfering with normal prison operations. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. This was not a routine inspection. This was something else entirely. I have been helping to fix things that were broken, Jake said, making the prison safer for everyone. Yes, Vex Prime nodded slowly. That is exactly the problem. Crex 9 is not supposed to be safe. It is supposed to be a place where hope dies and spirits break. You have been undermining that purpose. The administrator turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing alone in the corridor. But Jake could feel those black eyes watching him from security cameras hidden in the walls. He was being hunted now, and he did not even know why. That evening, Lieutenant Crix Vo came to Jake's cell earlier than usual. The young guard looked worried and kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to be following him. "You need to be very careful," Crix Vo whispered. "Vex Prime has been asking questions about you, about why the guards treat you differently than other prisoners." "What kind of questions?" Jake asked. "He wants to know who authorized your work assignments, who gave you access to restricted areas, who has been providing you with special privileges." Crix Vo paused. "He especially wants to know about the translation device." Jake felt his stomach drop. If Vex Prime found out that Crix Vo had been helping him, the young guard would face severe punishment, maybe even execution. "I will tell him I stole it," Jake said. "I will say I found it in the maintenance areas." "No." Crix Vo shook his head. He would not believe that. The translation devices are carefully tracked. He knows one is missing, and he knows someone gave it to you. Through the wall, Jake could hear Lin Shaw singing softly to herself. She did not know what was happening, but somehow she sensed that something was wrong. Her songs had become sadder over the past few days. "What does Vex Prime really want?" Jake asked. Crix Vo looked around again, then leaned closer to the cell bars. "I have heard rumors, stories about administrators who work with crime syndicates, who take bribes to look the other way when prisoners are murdered, who make sure certain people never get released even when they should." Jake began to understand. The sabotaged equipment, the deliberate failures of life support systems, the violence that guards were ordered not to stop. This prison was not just breaking people. It was killing them on purpose. "How many prisoners have died here in the past year?" Jake asked. "Too many," Crix Vo replied. "Far more than in other facilities. But the official reports always say it was natural causes or prisoner violence, never equipment failure, never administrative negligence." The next morning, Jake was pulled from his work assignment and brought to Administrator Vex Prime's temporary office. The room had been set up in what used to be a storage area, and it smelled like disinfectant and fear. "Sit down, prisoner. 4471, Vex Prime said without looking up from his data tablets. "We need to discuss your future." Jake sat in the metal chair facing the administrator's desk. On the walls around him were displays showing prisoner files and security footage. He could see himself on several screens working in the maintenance areas and talking with guards. "Your file says you are an engineer," Vex Prime continued. "But it does not explain why you have been allowed to work on critical systems, why you have access to areas normally restricted to staff only, why the guards seem to trust you." "Because I have been helpful," Jake answered. "Because I fix things instead of breaking them." "Yes, that is the problem." Vex Prime set down his tablet. and looked directly at Jake. This facility has a very specific purpose. It is designed to contain the worst criminals in the galaxy until they die. It is not designed to be comfortable or safe or efficient. Jake felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. So you want the life support to fail? You want people to die from preventable accidents? I want the natural order to be maintained, Vex Prime replied. Some people are meant to live, and some are meant to die. The sooner the latter group accepts their fate, the better it is for everyone. The administrator stood up and walked to a display showing security footage from Cell Block 7. Jake could see himself working with other prisoners to defend against the Screeth attack. He could see guards following his tactical suggestions. This is completely unacceptable, Vex Prime said, pointing at the screen. Prisoners do not coordinate with guards. They do not organize defensive strategies. They certainly do not prevent other prisoners from being killed. Why not? Jake asked. Why is it wrong to save lives? Because chaos serves a purpose. Vex Prime turned back to face him. Fear keeps prisoners obedient. Violence keeps them isolated. Despair makes them easier to control. You have been disrupting all of that. Jake realized that everything he thought he knew about this place was wrong. It was not a prison that happened to be badly run. It was a death camp disguised as a prison. And Vex Prime was here to make sure it stayed that way. I am transferring you to solitary confinement indefinitely, Vex Prime announced. You will have no contact with other prisoners or guards, no work assignments, no privileges of any kind. You will remain in isolation until you die of old age or despair, whichever comes first. That night, Jake lay on his cell floor and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow they would move him to a place where no one could hear him, and no one would care if he lived or died. All the progress he had made would be lost. All the friendships he had built would be severed. But as he lay there in the darkness, Jake realized something important. He had been documenting everything during his work in the maintenance areas. Every sabotaged system, every deliberate failure, every piece of evidence that showed this prison was designed to kill people, and he was not the only one who had seen it. Kex Nor knew. Some of the guards knew. Even a few prisoners knew. The truth was out there, waiting to be revealed. Jake just had to figure out how to get it to the right people before Vex Prime silenced him forever. Through the wall, he could hear Lin Shaw humming very quietly. 3 short notes followed by 2 long ones. It was a pattern they had used before, to say goodbye when they thought they might not see each other again. Jake hummed the same pattern back and heard her breath catch on the other side of the wall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Jake Morrison was still alive. Still. Thinking. Still fighting. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. 2 weeks passed before Lieutenant Crix Vo came back to Jake's cell. This time he was carrying something in his hands, and he looked nervous. The other guards on night shift were busy with their rounds, so they were alone in the corridor. I brought you something, Crix Vo said quietly. He held up a small metal tablet covered with alien writing. It is a translation device. I thought you might want to talk to the prisoner next to you. Jake took the tablet and turned it over in his hands. It was warm to the touch and felt heavier than it looked. When he pressed the button on the side, the screen lit up with symbols. He could not read. Why are you helping me? Jake asked. Crix Vo shifted his weight from one foot to the other. You said every life has value. I have been thinking about that, about what it means. The guard walked away before Jake could ask any more questions, but the tablet stayed behind, and that was what mattered. Jake waited until the corridor was empty, then tapped on the wall between his cell and the next one. The response came immediately. "Hello?" Jake said to the wall. The tablet buzzed and alien words appeared on the screen. Then those words changed into English letters. "Can you understand me now?" There was a long pause. Then a voice came from the other side of the wall. It was high and musical like wind chimes. "Yes, human, I can understand. My name is Lin Sha. I am from the water world of Kepler 9. Jake smiled. After 2 weeks of silence, it felt good to have a real conversation. "My name is Jake. I am from Earth." "I know about Earth," Lin Sha said. "It is a death world where everything tries to kill you." "How did you survive long enough to become an adult?" "Practice," Jake replied, and heard something that might have been laughter from the next cell. They talked through the night about their home worlds and how they had ended up in this place. Lin Sha had been a teacher before she was arrested for speaking out against her government. She had never hurt anyone, but the authorities said her words were dangerous. Jake told her about the bombing he did not do and the trial that was not fair. "Do you think we will ever get out of here?" Lin Sha asked as the artificial dawn began to light up the corridors. "I do not know," Jake answered honestly. "But I think we can make this place better while we are here." The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Jake worked with the maintenance crews during the day, fixing things that broke and improving systems that barely worked. At night, he talked with Lin Sha about everything and nothing. Sometimes Crix Vo would stop by and listen to their conversations through the translation device. Jake learned that the Vorthak were not as simple as they seemed. They had art and music and poetry just like humans did. They wrote stories about heroes who saved people and villains who caused suffering, but their society told them that showing emotion was weakness and caring about others was foolish. On "My world's strength is everything," Crix Vo explained one night. "The strong rule and the weak serve. That is the way it has always been." "But you brought me the translator," Jake pointed out. "That was not about strength. That was about kindness." Crix Vo was quiet for a long time. "Maybe," he finally said. "Or maybe I was just curious about what you would do with it." Jake was starting to understand how the prison really worked. The official report said it was a rehabilitation facility, but that was a lie. It was designed to break people down until they gave up hope of ever being free. The guards were part of the machine that crushed spirits and destroyed minds. But some of the guards were starting to question that machine. Jake could see it in the way they watched him work. He fixed problems instead of creating them. He helped people instead of hurting them. He treated everyone with respect, even when they did not deserve it. The big test came during the 3rd week when the Screeth gang decided they wanted to take over Cell Block 7. The Screeth were insect-like creatures with razor-sharp claws and no sense of mercy. They had killed 3 prisoners in other blocks, and the guards had done nothing to stop them. Jake was in the workshop when the fighting started. He heard screaming and the sound of metal being torn apart. Through the window, he could see smoke rising from the direction of his cell block. The maintenance workers around him were hiding under tables and behind machines. "We have to help," Jake said to Kexnor. "People are dying." "Not our job," Kexnor replied. His 4 arms were shaking with fear. "Guards will handle it," but Jake could see through the security monitors that the guards were not handling it. They were trapped outside the cell block, while the Screeth tore everything apart inside. The blast doors had sealed automatically when the violence started and nobody could get in or out. Jake grabbed the emergency override toolkit and ran toward Cell Block 7. Behind him, he could hear Kexnor calling for him to stop, but he did not slow down. Lin Sha was in there along with 30 other prisoners, and he was not going to let them die. The override controls were in a maintenance shaft above the blast doors. Jake had to crawl through another tight space while listening to the sounds of battle below him. When he reached the control panel, he found that someone had damaged it on purpose. The same someone who had been sabotaging other systems around the prison. Working by touch in the dark, Jake rewired the damaged circuits. His hands were steady even though his heart was racing. This was what he had trained for in the Marines. When everything went wrong, you stayed calm and you did your job. The blast doors opened just as Captain Zeth Ka arrived with a squad of guards. They rushed into the cell block expecting to find a massacre. Instead, they found something that shocked them all. The prisoners had organized themselves into defensive groups and were holding the Screeth at bay. Jake's tactical knowledge had helped them turn furniture into barriers and improvised weapons into effective tools. "How did you coordinate this?" Zeth Ka asked Jake after the Screeth were locked up in isolation cells. "I did not coordinate anything," Jake replied. "I just gave them some suggestions. They did the rest themselves." What Jake did not say was that he had used the prison's communication system to talk to prisoners in other cells. He had told them how to work together instead of fighting each other. He had shown them that cooperation was stronger than conflict. 3 prisoners had been injured in the fighting, but none had died. Jake helped the medical staff treat their wounds using techniques he had learned in combat zones. One of the injured was a young Vorthak who had been imprisoned for deserting from the military. "Why did you help me?" the young Vorthak asked as Jake bandaged a cut on his arm. "I am a coward and a failure." "You are alive," Jake said. "That makes you neither of those things." Word of what happened in Cell Block 7 spread through the prison like wildfire. The human prisoner who fought alongside the guards instead of against them. The terrorist who saved lives instead of taking them. The Deathworlder who chose cooperation over conquest. That night, Crix Vo came to Jake's cell with something new. It was a small wooden carving of a tree with intricate branches and leaves. The work was so detailed that Jake could see individual bark patterns. "I made this," Crix Vo said quietly. "It is a memory tree from my home world. We carve them to remember. Important moments." Jake accepted the gift carefully. "What moment does this one remember?" "The day I learned that strength and kindness are not opposites," Crix Vo replied. "They can exist in the same person at the same time." After the guard left, Jake sat in his cell looking at the carved tree. Through the wall, he could hear Lin Shaw humming one of her people's lullabies. In the distance, other prisoners were talking quietly instead of screaming. The night sounds were different now. Calmer somehow. Change was happening in this place, whether the authorities wanted it or not. One conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time. One person deciding that maybe things could be better. Jake had planted many seeds now, and some of them were starting to grow. Jake woke up to the sound of alarms screaming through the prison corridors. Red lights flashed on and off, making everything look like it was covered in blood. The other prisoners were yelling and banging on their cell doors, but Jake just sat up slowly and listened. After 10 years in the Marines, he had learned to stay calm when everyone else was panicking. The prisoner in the cell next to him was making scared noises. It was the same one who had been crying the night before. Jake tapped on the wall again and the noises stopped. He could hear breathing on the other side of the metal, but nothing else. A guard came running down the corridor. His scales were darker than the others Jake had seen, and he moved like he was hurt. The guard stopped in front of Jake's cell and looked at him with those cold yellow eyes. "You the guard said, pointing at Jake. "You are engineer, yes." Jake nodded. He had been an engineer before they arrested him. He had fixed everything from water pumps to spaceship engines. It was the one skill that had kept him alive during the war, and maybe it would help him here too. "Good," the guard said. "Life support is broken in Section 4. Many prisoners will die if we cannot fix it. You will help." It was not a question. Jake stood up and waited while the guard opened his cell door. The chains went back on his wrists, but they were longer this time, so he could use his hands. 2 more guards appeared, and they walked him through corridors he had not seen before. Section 4 was a disaster. The air was thick and hard to breathe, and Jake could see that the ventilation system had completely failed. 30 prisoners were trapped behind a blast door that had sealed itself when the emergency started. Through the small window, Jake could see them gasping for air and clawing at the walls. The head maintenance worker was a thin creature with blue skin and 4 arms. He was arguing with Guard Captain Zeth Ka in a language that sounded like birds fighting. Jake could tell they had no idea how to fix the problem. "What happened?" Jake asked when they stopped arguing. Zeth Ka turned to look at him. "Power surge caused cascade failure. Backup systems are offline. We have maybe 2 hours before prisoners suffocate." Jake walked over to the control panel and looked at the display. The writing was in alien script, but engineering was engineering. Power flowed the same way no matter what planet you were on. He could see where the problem was just by following the red warning lights. "I need tools," Jake said, "and someone who can read these displays for me." The maintenance worker, whose name was Kex Nor, stepped forward. He spoke better English than most of the guards, and he seemed eager to help. Together they opened the access panels, and Jake got his first look at alien technology. It was different from human engineering, but not as different as he had expected. The same basic principles applied. Power went from generators to distribution nodes to end users. When something broke, you found where the break was and you fixed it, or went around it. The real problem was in the main power coupling 3 levels, down. The surge had melted half the connections, and backup power was not reaching the life support systems. Jake could fix it, but it would take time they did not have. "Is there another way to get power to Section 4? Jake asked. Kex Nor pulled up a schematic on his tablet. "Emergency power conduits run through maintenance shafts, but they are too small for Vorthak to access." Jake looked at the shaft opening. It was barely big enough for a human to crawl through, and it looked like it had not been cleaned in decades. But 30 people were dying, and that was all that mattered. "I can fit," Jake said. "Tell me where to go." Zeth Ka looked surprised. "You would risk your life for prisoners you do not know." "Yes," Jake said simply. He did not explain that this was what humans did. They helped each other even when it made no sense, even when it was dangerous, even when nobody would thank them for it. The crawl through the maintenance shaft took 40 minutes. Jake dragged tools and spare parts behind him through spaces so tight he could barely turn his head. His jumpsuit tore on sharp metal edges, and his knees got cut up from crawling over rough surfaces. But he kept going because people were counting on him. The emergency power coupling was exactly where Kex Nor said it would be. Jake had to work by feel in the dark because there was no room for lights. His hands found the burned connections, and he started replacing them one by one. Each connection had to be perfect, or the whole system would fail again. While he worked, Jake could hear voices echoing through the ventilation system. The guards were talking about him in their own language, but Kex Nor was translating bits and pieces over the radio. They were surprised that a human prisoner was risking his life to save others. They had expected him to refuse or demand something in return. "Power coupling repaired," Jake said into his radio. "Testing connections now." The lights came back on, and Jake could hear the ventilation fans starting up again. Fresh air began flowing through the shafts, and he knew the prisoners in Section 4 would be breathing easier now. But his work was not done yet. "Backup systems are still offline," Kexnor said over the radio. "If primary power fails again, we will have same problem." Jake crawled deeper into the maintenance areas looking for the backup power controls. What he found was worse than he had expected. Half the backup systems had been deliberately disabled. Someone had removed key components and hidden them. This was not an accident. Someone wanted the life support to fail. "Captain Zethka," Jake said into his radio. "You need to hear this." When Jake finally crawled out of the maintenance shafts, he was covered in grease and dust, and his jumpsuit was more holes than fabric. But the prisoners in Section 4 were alive, and the backup systems were working again. More importantly, Jake had proof that someone was sabotaging the prison. Zethka looked at the disabled components Jake had found hidden in the maintenance areas. His yellow eyes got brighter when he was angry, and right now they were glowing like small suns. "Who has access to these areas?" Jake asked. "Only maintenance staff and senior administrators," Zethka replied. His voice was quieter than usual, which meant he was thinking hard about something. Jake handed over the components he had found. "Someone does not want this prison to work properly. Question is why?" That night, Jake was back in his cell, but things felt different. The guards who brought his food looked at him with something that might have been respect. One of them even nodded when he walked by. It was a small thing, but in a place like this, small things mattered. The prisoner in the next cell tapped on the wall, and Jake tapped back. This time, there were more taps in a pattern that sounded almost like a song. Jake tried to copy the pattern, and heard what might have been laughter from the other side. Lieutenant Crevaux appeared at Jake's cell door during the night shift. He was younger than most of the guards, and his scales were brighter green. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. "You saved 30 lives today," Crevaux finally said. Why Jake thought about how to answer that question. How could he explain to an alien that humans helped each other because that was what made them human? How could he explain that leaving people to die was worse than death itself? "Because they needed help," Jake said. "And I could help them." Crevaux tilted his head like he was trying to understand something that did not make sense to him. "But they are criminals, murderers and thieves. Why does their survival matter to you?" "Because they are alive," Jake replied. "And every life has value." The guard stood there for another few minutes thinking about what Jake had said. Then he walked away, without another word. But Jake noticed that he walked slower than usual, like he was carrying something heavy in his mind. Change started small in places like this. One conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one person deciding that maybe the way things were was not the way things had to be. Jake had planted a seed today, and now he would have to wait to see if anything would grow from it. The transport ship shuddered as it approached the massive prison station floating in the darkness of space. Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window and saw the thing that would be his home for the rest of his life. Crex 9 Maximum. Security detention facility looked like a giant metal spider with its legs wrapped around a dying red star. The whole structure glowed with an angry orange light that made Jake think of hell. The chains around his wrists felt heavier now. The alien guards had put them on him 3 days ago when they dragged him from the courtroom. He still could not believe what had happened. One day he was fixing water pumps for a human colony, and the next day he was blamed for bombing a space station. The trial was a joke. Nobody spoke his language properly, and nobody cared that he was innocent. The ship docked with a loud clang that echoed through the metal walls. Two massive creatures appeared at the door of his cell. They looked like walking crocodiles with thick green skin and yellow eyes that never blinked. These were Vorthak guards, and Jake had heard stories about them during his trip here. They were strong enough to crush a human skull with one hand and mean enough to enjoy doing it. "Move, human," one of them said in broken English. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. Jake stood up slowly. The chains made it hard to walk, but he did not want to give them a reason to hurt him. He had been a Marine before he became an engineer, and he knew when to fight and when to wait. The inside of the prison station was worse than Jake had imagined. The walls were made of dark metal that seemed to soak up all the light. The air smelled like rust and fear and something else he could not name. Other prisoners watched him walk by, and Jake saw things that would give him nightmares for weeks. There were creatures with too many arms and others with no arms at all. Some had scales, and some had fur, and some looked like they were made of living rock. The guard captain was waiting for them in the processing center. He was bigger than the other Vorthak and had scars all over his face and arms. A metal plate was bolted to his skull where part of his head used to be. His name tag said Zethka in alien writing that hurt Jake's eyes to look at. "So this is the famous human terrorist," Zethka said as he looked Jake up and down. "You do not look like much. Are you sure this small thing destroyed a whole space station?" "That is what the file says," the other guard replied. "Class 15 Deathworld. Species. Extremely dangerous. Handle with maximum caution." Zethka laughed, but it sounded more like a growl. "Deathworld or not, he looks weak to me. How long do you think he will last in general population?" 3 days if he is lucky," the guard answered. "Maybe less if the Screeth get to him first." Jake wanted to tell them he was innocent, but he had learned that nobody here cared about the truth. The trial had taught him that much. Instead, he just stood there and let them talk about him like he was not even there. It was better to let them think he was weak and scared. Sometimes that was the best weapon a man could have. They took him to a room full of machines that scanned his body and recorded everything about him. The computers beeped and hummed as they measured his height and weight and took pictures of his face from every angle. A robot arm took blood from his finger, and another one cut off a piece of his hair. Jake tried not to think about what they might do with that information. When the scanning was done, they gave him a gray jumpsuit that was too big and shoes that were too small. The number 4471 was printed on the back in black letters. That was his name now. Not Jake Morrison, but Prisoner 4471. He tried not to let that bother him, but it did anyway. The walk to his cell block took 20 minutes through corridors that seemed to go on forever. Jake saw other prisoners working in kitchens and workshops. Most of them ignored him, but a few stopped to stare. He heard whispers in languages he did not understand, but the tone was always the same. They were talking about the new meat and wondering how long he would survive. Cell Block 7 was where they put the worst criminals. Jake learned this from the guard who opened his cell door and pushed him inside. The cell was small and dark, with a metal bed and a toilet that looked like it had not been cleaned in years. The walls were covered with scratches and stains that Jake did not want to think about too hard. "Welcome to your new home, human," the guard said before slamming the door shut. The sound echoed through the corridor like a gunshot. Jake sat down on the bed and looked around his new home. It was smaller than the closet in his apartment back on Earth, but it would have to do. He had survived worse places during his time in the Marines. At least here nobody was shooting at him. Yet. The other prisoners in his block started making noise as soon as the guards left. Someone was screaming in a high voice that made Jake's teeth hurt. Someone else was banging something metal against the bars of their cell. A third voice was singing what sounded like a funeral song in a language that had too many vowels. Jake lay down on his bed and stared at the ceiling. There was a message scratched into the metal above his head. It said, "Hope dies here," in 3 different languages. Someone had crossed out the human words and written "not yet" underneath in shaky letters. Jake wondered who had done that and what had happened to them. Sleep came slowly that first night. Every sound made him think someone was coming to kill him. Every shadow looked like a monster waiting to attack. But Jake had learned long ago that worry never solved anything. Tomorrow he would start figuring out how to stay alive in this place. Tonight he just needed to rest and stay alert. As he finally started to drift off, he heard something that made him open his eyes. It was the sound of someone crying very quietly in the cell next to his. It was a soft sound full of pain and loneliness. Jake knew that sound because he had made it himself during his first night in basic training all those years ago. He got up and walked to the wall that separated his cell from the next one. He tapped very gently on the metal 3 times. After a moment, the crying stopped. Then he heard 3 taps back. Jake smiled for the first time since his arrest. Maybe this place was not completely hopeless after all. Maybe there were still people here who remembered what it meant to be human, or at least what it meant to care about someone else's pain. That was the beginning of everything that would happen next.